Colorado Springs, Colorado, and this morning got up early and went and did the Manitou incline, which if you don't know what that is, look it up. It was quite the physically exerting activity. But now we're at the Manitou Cliff Dwellings, which is an ancient southwestern Native American settlement, or the remains of it. So I really don't know a whole lot about this culture, so I'm going to be kind of learning as I go, but from what I can see so far, looks pretty cool. Alright, so we're going to hit the museum first before we hit the ruins and see what we got. Kind of typical of the Pueblo and some of the Southwest Native American tribes was their pottery. So they have a bunch of different examples, some pretty old. So here's some from either 750 to 1100 AD. And a lot of these were recovered from ranchers who had occupied them from different Pueblo homes. I'm a pretty big bow hunter, so seeing some of these old arrowheads and spearheads and things like that, stuff that they would hunt with, is always really fascinating to me. And there's some stone knives down here that they would have used. Pretty cool. Now look at this. Using willow limbs as axe handles. Pretty cool. And what is that? Okay, so this is really interesting. Apparently these cliff-dwelling Indians had this practice where they would take something called a cradle board and strap it to the back of a baby's head while it was still soft. And then the result, as you can see here, is that the head would develop, or the skull would develop, to where it was flat in the back. So for these people, their head was as wide as it was long. Okay, so here's a normal skull of a Cheyenne Native American, and then here's one of the cliff dwellers. Interesting. Sweet heavenly days. So here's the skull of an individual that supposedly they think suffered from headaches, which they thought was an evil spirit lurking within the skull. So to get it out, they drilled holes in the head. Okay, now going into the Pueblo Museum. Yeah, so this is kind of cool. This is some prehistoric rock art called a petroglyph that was discovered around the turn of the century in the Rocky Mountains. So this is kind of a neat thing showing the progression of how a pueblo was made. First you dig a pit and then get a fire pit in the middle of it, different holes for support posts, and then you line it with stone slabs. Get yourself a frame and then cover it up with thick adobe mud. Build a fire. And then you move in, good to go. So I mentioned how the Pueblo and the Southwest American, Native American populations, are pretty well known for their pottery. So here's the progression of how the pottery is made. So you start off with a rope of clay, and then you kind of coil it up in this manner, going more and more, adding another coil, kind of pinching it off as you go. Keep repeating that step until you get this finished product that you would put into a kiln, fire it up, and then polish it off. course, any kind of hunting stuff always fascinates me. So here's some stone game balls. Here's some netting that they would use out of yucca cord. There's a game snare there in the back. And of course, just a good old-fashioned club. Here's a Ute Indian bow and arrow that was found in a basket maker cave. This is called a double curved bow. So it's kind of interesting. I've never seen a design like that before. And then here's kind of a more traditional bow and arrow design, like what you might think of. Okay, so earlier we saw the skulls that were deformed from the cradle boards. Well, this is a cradle board. So you can kind of see there in the back, that flat board. And then the infant would have their head laying up against that thing. And then the result was those deformed skulls. A little bit of non-typical action going on there. Pretty cool. So these cultures were really big into farming. That was kind of their mainstay, especially corn. So here you have a big grinding stone. And then over here, mortar and pestle that they would use to pound out herbs and roots into a kind of powder. Okay, so we just walked out of the museum. The museum was darn cool. I learned a lot in there. Probably the most interesting was the skulls, and then of course for me, looking at the hunting equipment. So now we're going to go up to the Cliff Dwellings and take a look at what they got there. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and start moving in here and see if we can adjust our lighting where we can see. And wow, one of the first things that you notice getting in here is that the temperature really drops. It's a lot cooler in here. Just as a pretty hot, arid part of the country, so man, they definitely had that right. Got a storage bin in here made out of these different tiles. And apparently this is a refuse area. So something kind of interesting in the refuse area. It said there that burials were done outside in warm weather, but during cold weather they would do it here in this refuse area. And then the result was that the body would be perfectly mummified. They would also put turkeys in here to kind of feed on some of the waste products. I don't think that the metal railing was part of the original structure. So this is a ceremonial pit called a kiva, which would be accessed by the men, and would have this fire pit down in there. Very cool. There's something showing like the internal stone lace work. Now this wasn't quarried. These stones were picked up and then used to build these walls. And they'd be a two-story structure, so two families could live in there. There's a stone tower construction. They really don't know what the use of the stone tower was. Could have been ceremonial, could have been like a lookout tower. It's a bit of a mystery. Okay, so that is the Manitou Cliff Dwellings. Now, something else that's kind of interesting is that these cliff dwellings weren't originally here. In the early 1900s, they were basically relocated from a southwestern portion of Colorado. But there were people that were concerned with looters and vandals, didn't want to see this history disappear. So they picked it up, cataloged each piece, and then reconstructed it piece by piece right here in Colorado Springs. I have kind of mixed feelings about that. There's part of me that likes to see original history in its original place. But I also can appreciate the fact that they wanted to preserve it and wanted to keep it from being vandalized and being taken by looters over time. So that's the Manitou Cliff Dwellings. Very interesting piece of history, and I learned something that, learned a lot of things that I didn't know before. So yeah, we're in here in Colorado for a little bit and got a lot more to learn.